So I thought the easiest thing was to start off just by the four of you introducing yourselves, and then we'll get into the into the subject of the panel. So please, Moriba, I'm not quite sure which way to gesture at you. I'm going to gesture that way.
You want me to say some stuff or what? Man?
Just like you say, yeah, like, but at this point, the stuff I would like is just to introduce yourself to the room. Tell us who you are.
All right, man. So here I go. Moriba, Associate Professor of Aerospace Engineering Mechanics at the University of Texas at Austin. Also co-founder and chief scientist of Privateer and co-founder and president of Moriba Universal. Coming to you live from the Space Object Situation Room here in Austin, Texas.
Brilliant. And unlike Laurie Leshen, he actually has something behind him to show you. So, Christopher.
Yep. So I'm Christopher. I'm from Germany, a co-founder of OKAPI Orbits, and we are helping satellite operators, especially new space satellite operators, be sustainable in space and have sustainable space operations.
Okay. Bhavya.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bhavya Lal. I'm an engineer by training and an analyst through and through. For the last few years, I was the Associate Administrator for Technology, Policy, and Strategy at NASA and got the opportunity to create an office at NASA, which thought about these issues. And I was listening to Pipa's talk, and I remember an analysis we did on the cost benefit of asteroid mining. So my claim to fame and the reason I think I'm here is because I think in terms of cost and benefits, and, you know, as an economist-sponsored conference, it's an exciting.
Absolutely. And Rick.
Hi, I'm Rick, and I do space. So
okay. That's fine. But I think people who know you will get that. Yeah.
Perfect.
And then the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. So I thought we'd start off this. I mean, when I saw this, I'll say that I did think, yeah, there's a space junk panel because there's always a space junk panel. But then I put this in the context of a really fascinating report that some colleagues Barriers put out last year at NASA on, as you said, cost and benefit analysis of orbital debris remediation. And so we all know that one of the key rules of orbital debris is don't make any more of it. And another of them is look after your satellites and bring them down. But there has always been this question of what else do you do? What do you do to remediate? And I wanted to start off the panel by asking Bhavya to tell us a little bit about what that study found.
Sure thing, Oliver. And again, I hope you all have a chance to go read the report. It's actually quite a complex topic, and the analysis is complex as well. It was led by my colleague, Tom Colvin, and it kind of turned conventional wisdom on its head. Conventional wisdom says it's about number of debris objects, right? We always hear about 30,000 objects over 10 centimeters, 100 million over a millimeter and above, and so forth. And if number is your proxy for risk, then the only answer is reduction in numbers, whether by removal. However, if you open up the aperture to other, if the proxy is no longer number, you can look at other options. For example, nudging things out of the way, which was never really an option because we only thought in terms of numbers. So that's the first reframing in the report. And the report then goes on to looking at risk directly. The cost, it quantifies the cost of destruction caused by debris to specific satellites and pits it against the cost of removing that piece of debris. And then the report looks at many different options. And bottom line up front is that lasers are actually a really cost-effective approach to debris remediation. For larger objects, you nudge things out of the way. In the short term, that's much cheaper than having very expensive approaches which aren't even really proven. And smaller debris, which we just tended to ignore because we didn't know a way to clean it up or deorbit it, is suddenly relevant because, well, as you know, small debris is what ends space missions. And now with lasers, you can actually nudge small debris into deorbit. So that's kind of the bottom line of the report. And I really hope, and it's work in progress and it's controversial. So I hope that we will all continue to have this discussion.
Cool. I wanted Moriba, did you see that report when it came out? And how does it strike you to look at this remediation question in that way, that's not focused on numbers but on specific benefits of various sorts of action?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that makes a lot of sense, and certainly, I think being able to couch things in terms of the orbital carrying capacity. Not all orbits are created equal, kind of thing, and we don't launch things into random places. So I think definitely looking at things in terms of the carrying capacity for the orbital highway that these things are occupying, and how can we provide capacity back to these orbits by removing some number, not just number of objects, but also the mass of these things and that sort of stuff, like derelict rocket bodies and that sort of stuff. I think that makes a lot of sense.
And what's the view from OKAPI on this approach?
It feels like we are all very in line with this analysis and what's coming out of it. The debris, basically, first we shouldn't create the debris in the first place. That's kind of the thing that I'm very interested in, I would say. After that, mitigation, of course, by removing it, it's cost intensive. As it was said, and there are exciting things coming up, like the lasers that you were mentioning, but also for bigger objects, the debris removal missions, right, to get rocket bodies, etc. We need those missions, nevertheless. I think because those objects, those giant rocket bodies that are up there, they're a potential hazard for fragmentations and creating more debris. So we should get those, when possible, out of the way. And for some of them, maybe with active debris removal.
One of the things that's really interesting to me about that report is the way that it shows that in some ways the Kessler syndrome is already here, and that if no one launched anything again, the number of objects in orbit would continue to get larger. And that as I understand it, Bhavya, correct me if I'm wrong, that the benefit of removing things from orbit is that you slow down that process. The benefit is not actually specifically in terms of it won't hit a satellite, but it's more in terms of, no idea what that was. It's more in terms of it won't create yet more debris. That's right? Yes?
So the report is much more focused on sort of the remediation piece and what is relevant in the near term. I think most studies in this domain look at 100-year, 500-year, 1,000-year time frame, which is when Kessler syndrome is more of an issue. In the very near term, 1 year, 5 years, we need to do something. And we need to do something about small debris, which we cannot even track very well, let alone remove. And we need to do something about large debris. And I agree with Christopher that it would be nice if we could remove the large pieces in a cost-effective way. We are not there yet. So in the meantime, let's see if we can nudge things out of the way and make the space so we don't have that increasing numbers of creation of more debris.
Rick, what is, as a veteran, how do you see this change in?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we obviously have to protect Sandra Bullock and George Clooney. But
Absolutely.
That's critical. But yeah, and you mentioned asteroid mining. It was so funny because somebody in my company at that time pointed out, well, we're going to fly through all this valuable metal to go find asteroids. So the thing is that there has to be a change in the culture as well. So there's immediate remediation. There needs to be incentives put in place for those who are going to go after the larger grabbable objects. Then we have the question of, do we up orbit or deorbit? I'm a big fan of up orbit for the larger ones, maybe a junkyard or something in a high orbit.
Is that because you want to have some resources out there to go and grab, or?
I think to me, it's a cultural thing. I think as we move into space, the idea of waste, right? This idea of wasting things needs to stop. Right. We have a culture of use it and throw it away. I'm going to talk about this later in the afternoon. And we have to get away from that. Right. Now, the smaller ones, I understand, the very small objects, the paint chips, things like that, very, very, very challenging. So there is a distribution, a risk distribution here that we have to look at. These larger objects are breeders. That's critical. So let's get them out. let's put disincentives in place, and then let's put the regulatory framework in some sort of centrally organized. Who's in charge of this, globally, and at the level of states? It's all over the place. So we need to bring it together. Maybe there is some sort of deposit you put down. Maybe we create global sanctions, major global sanctions against anybody who purposefully creates, by doing an ASAT test, for example. There's a lot of ways to approach it.
Can I underscore something Rick said, which is really important about deorbiting versus uporbiting? We don't know what will be the environmental impact of tens of thousands of satellites coming down. I mean, there is no literature on that. And, we worry about climate change. What is the effect of all of that metal collecting in the top layer of the atmosphere for climate change? We do not know that. So it's an active area of research, but it feeds into what Rick said about, let's see if we can get things up and maybe then we can reuse, right?
I had a friend once say to me, well, they're going to burn up. Well, there's intense heat at the center of that burnup, but then there's degrees of heat. There are compounds that are being created as it's plunging through the upper atmosphere that are being distributed. We don't know what the impact is going to be. And this is one of those cases where human beings have a tendency to barrel forward, create environmental damage that only later do we realize we have created. So we have to begin now by changing the culture.
I think that's a great point. I'd like to actually, I was struck when I was looking at the bios, that Moriba is one of the few people I've ever seen described as an environmentalist and astrodynamicist. Which just seems to me to be the most wonderfully 21st century thing you could possibly be. Do you see that same sort of philosophy of of trying to get ahead of the problem, of trying to work through not just mitigating the immediate risk, but thinking about the situation in terms of a long-term commons?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I have to say that I draw a lot of inspiration from indigenous people across the globe in so-called traditional ecological knowledge tech, call it ancient tech. And, some of these indigenous people, man, they have huddles where they think about making decisions for 10 generations ahead. To me, it's like the epitome of inclusion is providing a seat at the table for the voices that still are yet to come. And inhabit, spaceship Earth kind of thing. So I definitely believe in that. And I think something to add in terms of like incentives for trying to minimize, the pollution in space, just like, Rick said, quite well, and everybody else there on the panel, Bhavya and Christopher, is trying to develop a circular economy in space. I mean, right now we have circular economy concepts for land, certainly for ocean. We should do that, for space. And this prioritizes minimizing pollution by focusing on reusable and recyclable rockets and satellites. We got reusable rockets. We don't have reusable and recyclable satellites. We want to be able to do that and support that instead of abandoning things, which is kind of the way that we are currently doing things. But anyway, long story short, ancient tech, I think indigenous people, they have something to show us about being like the OGs, the original stewards of the planet. If they've been able to find ways to live sustainably, I think we have something to learn from indigenous cultures.
Yeah, and indigenous, I mean, I was just thinking about this when people was talking about Svalbard. There is an incredible sense of link there between the Arctic cultures who, after all, learned to live in places where most cultures would not dare to go.
Absolutely. No, so here's the thing, man. I find this very interesting, and no loss of love to analog astronauts and that sort of stuff. But it's like people are trying to find ways to simulate being in a harsh environment and putting some sort of capsule in the middle of a desert and something like that for space exploration. And I'm like, why don't you just go talk to indigenous cultures that have been living in very harsh environments and have thrived for not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years, right? So I think if anybody knows how to do that and do that well, it's indigenous cultures.
That took us an interesting long way into the idea of the long-term future seen in the long-term past. One thing that really strikes me in looking at this subject now, as opposed to when it all seemed slightly like in the future, is just how autonomous spacecraft are. Has that changed the way people, I mean, for your business, Chris, I mean, you really, if the spacecraft couldn't do anything with the data, you wouldn't really have much to do, would you?
Oh, well, I think there's still a lot to do. And I mean, the spacecraft does need the information from somewhere, right?
Absolutely. But if it couldn't maneuver, then there wouldn't be any point at all.
Yeah, that's true. But still, there are ways of handling this. There are like drag maneuvers. They can still be notched by lasers, etc. So yeah, we need to get people maneuvering up there, and maybe to the point of circular economy. I really love that we have these missions coming up that are on-orbit surfacing missions, and trying to extend the life of satellites, etc. That is a really good development from my point of view. And maybe a second thing that you said, Rick, we need this change of behavior in the way we do space operations. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that right now, especially for those bigger constellations that are coming up. They have a different mindset on redundance, basically. When earlier we had really expensive satellites, they had redundancy on board and could handle failures. With these bigger, especially new space operators, we are hearing, okay, or when one fails, we have another one, right? And this is something where I think we need a change of a mindset.
How so? So a bit more about what that change might actually be.
Well, we shouldn't allow for those, let's say, failing satellites in the first place, right? Or have a good plan how to get them out of the way so that they're not occupying the slots and ramping up the junk in those valuable orbits.
You say we, which is always a slightly red flag word to me. Who is the we that has to do this? Because this also comes back to Rick said, that we need to get together. Well, I think we know vaguely who we are who need to get together. There is everyone who's got a stake in this particular game. But what are the actual institutional ways that you might want to do that? Where do you actually go to try and govern this?
So I think it is more than the mindset. Again, just before even I get to the we bit. So the government, the US government, Department of Defense, that actually does what's called space situation awareness and tracking. Their systems are for the olden days where satellites didn't continually thrust. So the government systems are not capable of doing the sorts of things Moriba and Christopher and Rick are talking about. It takes a government a week before a new satellite is locked on, which may have been fine in the olden days when we were launching one satellite a year. But if we are now launching, 60 satellites a week, having, it taking a week to get a satellite in the catalog is not acceptable. Or the fact that the government systems aren't able to handle continually thrusting satellites, which is how most of future satellites are going to be. So I think the biggest change needs to happen within government before we go off to the private sector and tell them to do things differently or at the same time.
But do you need to bring that change in at the level of a particular government or all governments? Where does the actual decision making, Rick, you're nodding sagely. And that's always a mistake on one of my panels because it makes me think you have something to say.
No, I was just nodding. No, I'm kidding. Okay, I'm going to win friends and influence people again. When you have the world's largest space powers existing and operating from a paradigm of use it and throw it away. So, for example, that big orange monstrosity that NASA wants to launch, the Senate launch scam. Sorry, SLS, right? It's a pile of garbage. Oh, Rick, no, it's literally a pile of garbage. They're going to launch it and throw the entire thing away. NASA also is planning on deorbiting, throwing away an entire building called the space station onto the Earth. That betrays a mindset in the establishment of that we can plunder and pillage, that somehow Mother Earth, the Mother World, can absorb all of this, which is a very, very, very long-standing and ancient way of thinking, but one we have to leave behind as we go into space. And so I would urge, for example, new space companies, the young people who are rising up and forming companies, to come at them with a new paradigm. You know, I call it the frontier paradigm. You can call it whatever you like. You know, I saw a thing in the hotel room last night. It was about Costa Rica, and they're cleaning up Costa Rica, and they've come up with the term pura vida, right? Pure life.
Mhm.
And it's all about cleaning and saving the rivers and everything. And forgive my Spanish here, but I mean, maybe we need like Astra Vida or something like that. We need to have an attitude that we reuse, replace, repurpose, recycle everything we take to space. That has to happen, because if we don't do it, and we're all really proud of our economy and we're all kicking butt and doing all kinds of things, if we don't do it, the world is going to do it. The new generation that's rising is going to raise up and shut us down. So we have to do it ourselves.
I'm really struck by that vision. It's not a vision that necessarily conflates with the actual experience of frontier living, which has often actually been quite deleterious. Indigenous people who live in strange places, difficult places for a long time, isn't expropriation, that sort of mindset, isn't that very crucial to certainly the American frontier experience?
Well, I'm redefining frontier.
Oh,
Okay. I'm saying, great, everything that was wrong, and we did it the wrong way. And Moriba, apologies to Moriba, I love the idea of indigenous cultures, but they also create waste. It just happens that their waste is organic and melts back into the environment. We don't have that luxury. Our waste is not organic. Our waste lives and damages the planet. So we need to come into this with an attitude of, how do we have that circular economy, which I totally agree with Moriba on. How do we create a circular economy? We are in a finite spaceship. That's it, you know, and we will kill ourselves at some point. So we'll get into expropriation later.
I'm just thinking that isn't it a shame you weren't around in 1963 to say, no, Mr. Roddenberry, it's space, the redefined frontier, not the final frontier.
Yeah, it's funny because I have Rod Roddenberry coming to my conference next month, and his dad actually got me into the field. Yeah, well, final is kind of a negative thing, but, you know, the infinite frontier, whatever. But I do think, though, that this attitude, and I think studies like this, companies like OKAPI, begin to carve into what we have to do as we open this up. But when the major powers are still operating in the old way, we have to get them to change. You know, it's not that they are inherently evil or bad.
Okay, let's take it that we agree on that need for change. What is as a panel, what is our theory of change? Having recently left a government, Bhavya, how do you actually get to the people you recently left? I'm not saying your immediate colleagues. How do you get a government to care about this? Or do you have? Sorry, did someone just laugh loudly?
Yeah, that was me, man. That was me. That was me.
Oh, right. Hey, man.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
yeah. Remember,
I'm not putting your picture on the fold back. So yeah, say some more.
No worries, man. You know, I've been looking at your back for the whole time. No, so here's the thing, right? And apologies, you know, Bhavya will certainly chime in here, but you know, this whole thing about how do you get governments to care? I mean, it's not going to be like pretty please, sugar on top, trying to beckon to governments to behave altruistically. Who are we kidding? That's not going to happen. Right now, we have an orbital occupation, just like we have occupation and colonialism of lands, and we're seeing some of that whole thing play out as we speak, right? In, you know, Israel, Palestine, this idea of occupation, what happens? So we have orbital occupation happening right now. We don't have deeds to orbital space, but it is a first come, first served. And countries, I mean, governments are ultimately responsible, but governments are encouraging orbital occupation to happen because it's legal, but it doesn't mean that it's okay. There's like the equivalent land grab for space right now. And, you know, I don't have, you know, harsh feelings towards Starlinks and that sort of stuff with what I'm about to say, but the fact is over half of the world's operating satellites belong to SpaceX. And at this point, if you want to go anywhere across 500-kilometer altitude, you got to coordinate with Elon Musk. I mean, that is orbital occupation. And the thing is other countries are pissed off about it. They have a reason to be pissed off about it. You know, China is now saying, well, you know, I'm going to start launching things into the same orbital shell as the Starlinks. That's already started to happen. Russia put things just like a few kilometers or tens of kilometers above. They don't communicate well with each other. What could go wrong? So the thing is, this whole thing, just because things are legal, there's no, you know, one of the things that I talked about with indigenous cultures very recently, and I went to this island called Molokai. Molokai is one of the islands that forms part of Maui County. And there's a group of kids at Molokai High School and Nakaula School that I've been visiting for a few years. And, you know, they said the culture here on Molokai is we share things. You folks are not a space community. You're space individuals, and you have pockets that group with each other, but you don't share space. It should be a shared space, but we don't share space. We're not coordinating, we're not planning and coordinating that sharing. And so just by occupying orbits, that's going to piss other people off. They're going to react. They're going to just, everybody wants to do whatever it is that they want, how they want. That will end in a tragedy of the commons for sure.
So what's your theory of change?
The theory of change is by being transparent, man. It's basically putting out evidence, because there's a lot of mudslinging, right? There's the US saying China's doing this, Russia's saying the US is doing that or whatever, but nobody's putting out the evidence to let a greater group of people be able to draw conclusions from. Everybody's hiding the evidence, but making accusations. I think transparency is certainly one of the foremost things that need to happen. Certainly, I'm working on this sort of thing, is putting evidence out there about how people are behaving without being judgmental about it, but letting people say, hey, here's how people are behaving. Here's what's going on. Do you think this is a good idea? And if not, then have an inclusive dialogue to start figuring out what to do about it.
So transparency, not just as an operating principle in terms of knowing where things are, but as a fundamental philosophical approach to dealing with the spread of the human experience into orbit. Is that where we get from a panel about space junk? In which case, I think we've gone a really interesting way.
Maybe from my point of view,
Yeah.
I would take it one step back. I mean, transparency, especially in the orbits, it's very important. And we have talked about this, Moriba, for many years, that we need to share our orbital elements and our plans, our maneuver plans, etc. I mean, immediate for what we need for the next few years in order to tackle this huge increase of satellite operations on orbit is a way to coordinate. That's what also Moriba just mentioned, and we heard in the panel before, space traffic management. And that basically needs a platform where we can share the data, where people or satellite operators are basically forced to share the data. And that makes room actually on orbit to operate more and more satellites. So have the right of way in orbit, so to say.
So we like silver bullets. What's the one thing that can be done? But unfortunately, there isn't a silver bullet. There's 4 things we need to do. We need to launch less debris. And there are lots of ways to do that, or at least create less debris, not launch less debris. We need to know where every object in space is. Otherwise, we cannot do anything about it. We need to be able.
Do you mean really every object, or every object down to a given? I mean, do you want to catalog everything, or?
Well, we try already to catalog all the way down to 1 centimeters, and we need to be able to do that better, because those are the things that'll hit our satellites. We need to be able to maneuver, and we need to be able to remediate. So those are 4 things that we need to do, and we need to do that with technology. Because right now, even if, there was all the regulations and enforcement in the world, we do not know how to grab something reliably if it's spinning, for example, and move it. So we need technology development where NASA comes in. We need policy where, there's guidance, we need to come down in 1 year, 5 years, whatever. And we need regulations. So it's like, it's all of the above. And there isn't a single answer.
If you had the policy and the guidance and the regulations, would you also want the sort of philosophy that we were just hearing about? This idea of this more radical idea of an unoccupied commons, of a communally managed resource?
Go ahead and say yes, Bhavya. Say yes. Damn
I
it.
think
Say yes.
It would be, so at the risk of alienating Moriba, I mean, I don't think it's realistic. I think SpaceX isn't going to stop launching. Kuiper, which is the next thing that's going up, isn't going to stop. Europeans are starting to launch constellations, as are the Chinese. So I don't think this is, the momentum is stopping. So we just need to figure out how to make the best of this, of the situation we are going to be entering in.
Rick, I'm never sure that you've struck me as someone who makes the best of things rather than tries to do something different. Where do you stand on this?
Change starts with change. Change doesn't start by looking at who's next to you and figuring out what they're doing. You have to lead. We have to begin. There are so many technologies, cultural, financial, other tools that we can apply to this. I mean, we can use AI maybe for something more important than me getting a dozen pictures myself with hair or something, you know. We can use AI to track all of these things. We can create cultural incentives, create a morality of not wasting and trashing the solar system. I mean, even I was looking at the thing here, the title of this panel, what goes up must come down. You're starting from a bias right there.
I was just, you have stolen my my lovely summing up things, which was, we came in here with saying that at the end of the Fireside chat beforehand, that the key word was up.
Yeah, and
so what goes up can keep going up.
Can keep going up, or what goes up must be cleaned up or reused or whatever. There is also the transparency. Everybody who throws something into space that's going to be deorbited probably should go into a chamber and simulate those deorbit conditions when that thing burns up and give us a count of the different kinds of chemicals that come out of it so that we know what's going into the atmosphere. Nobody does. Nobody wants to know. I mean, oh my God, if we found out, we might have to do something about it, right? We have to have a cultural shift. And it's people in this room, people that are running these companies, people that work for NASA and ESA and all these other entities that have the ability to begin pushing for these kinds of changes.
And thus my work of summing up is done. And thank you very much, Rick. Thank you very much to all the panelists for a fascinating panel.